Uvalde, Texas.
Gonna make the world safe for democracy, aren't you?
What is democracy? What is democracy?
It's got something to do with young men killing each other.
Tonight, the push for gun control legislation.
When it comes my turn, will you want me to go?
For democracy, any man would give his only begotten son.
So this video is actually uploaded about a week late. The reason I uploaded it late was I didn't like the direction the video was going before, and so I wanted to re-record and restructure this video so it actually accurately reflected my thoughts and beliefs on what's actually happening in the world and what's coming in the future. And the reason I say that is, if you take away one thing from today's video, I want you to understand the left wing and the right wing are both attached to the same bird. This whole thing about the left-right paradigm was created to keep people fighting amongst themselves so that they won't actually see who the true enemy is. And so when I originally started filming this video, I was making stuff about the left and what their beliefs are, and the right and what their beliefs are. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter. We need to matter what the belief of the actual bird is, not its wings. So what I want to do is take you through a history of gun control in America. I want to talk about how homicide rates have gone up and gone down. I want to talk about these mass atrocities that have been going on and why we're seeing them happen in clusters and what we can do about it. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the way I think a government can actually ban guns without actually writing any gun control legislation. It's always the same song and dance. Some crazy kid gets their hands on a firearm, commits a mass atrocity. Then immediately following the incident, politicians, presidents, special interest groups, and protesters immediately start singing the mantra of gun control, trying to push legislation through Congress. The claim is simple: less guns equals less crime, specifically less murders. But what if I told you they're wrong? In order to understand this, we need to go back to a time in American history when we had very few gun laws. And during that time, we had zero mass atrocities. We need to go back to the 1950s. Now, I understand the 1950s had its own problems. Racism being one of them. And thankfully, we've gotten that mostly taken care of. But despite that problem, did you know up until the 1960s, kids had guns at school? They had gun safety courses that were taught at school. They had gun clubs for competitive shooting at school. There was no age restriction on buying firearms. In fact, a 15-year-old kid who committed a felony, went to jail, got out, whatever, he could go buy a gun from a gun store. But not only that, he could go to a catalog, purchase it, no background check, have it shipped to his home, and he could easily just go out, kill a bunch of people. And yet they had zero incidences in regarding a mass shooting. Why is that? Now, I want to make something very clear here, guys. I think for the most part, all Americans agree that one life lost, especially in the instance of a child, is one life too many. I will be the first person to tell you, if there was 100% proof that banning firearms from the hands of American citizens would completely eradicate all murders, like if there was 100% definitive proof, I would be the first person to sign that. But unfortunately, history speaks a different story. And I'm not the kind of person to react emotionally to something. I try to put my emotions aside and I try to look at data to see what the data tells me, and I try to make decisions based on said data. It should also be noted that this video is not monetized. I don't have any sponsorships in this video. I don't have monetization turned on in this video, and I don't have any links in the video description where you can buy anything, because I don't like the fact that people can profiteer off of someone's untimely death. So as we're going through this video, we're going to be following this graph right here. And this graph shows the homicide rate in America from 1900 all the way to around 2020 or so. My goal is to understand this graph because you can see up until around 1933, crime rate was going up. Yet from 1933 all the way until around 1968 or so, crime rate was at an all-time low. Then you can see that crime shoots up from the late 60s and maintains all the way until about 1990, 1991. Then it goes down to a historic low, and then it plateaus for about 10 years, and then it goes down even more. Something to keep in mind about this graph, this is overall homicide rate. This includes all homicides, whether they're gang related, whether they're mass shootings, whether they're amongst friends or families or whoever. This is just overall. Mass shootings follow a very different pattern. In fact, mass shootings almost don't follow a pattern at all. And we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. But I want to understand this graph. I want to understand why during the 1940s and 50s and most of the 60s, why weren't there any school shootings when people had access to guns at schools? And the reason I say that is this kind of disputes the claim that having more and easier access to firearms results in less homicide, because the data seems to show otherwise. So, I mean, we have more laws today than we ever did. I mean, you gotta pass a background check in order to purchase a firearm today. You gotta be at least 18 years old to buy a rifle and 21 years old to buy a handgun. Yet, the media and the politicians are trying to tell us that, oh, it's too easy for people to get their hands on a gun. If you're the kind of person that believes in this rhetoric, and I hate to break it to you, but if you go to a gun store, if you have a legal, say a state issued marijuana card, you're not going to be able to buy a gun. If you have a felony on your record, you're not going to be able to have a gun. If you've had any drug related misdemeanors on your record, you're not going to be able to buy a gun. If you've had any types of domestic violence in your life that's ever been reported, you're not going to be able to buy a gun. If you've had any types of mental illness that show that you'll be a threat to yourself or others, you're not going to be able to buy a gun. So what do these politicians think they're actually going to do? Because here's the problem. To put this in an analogy of what politicians are trying to do right now, they're trying to say something like this: drunk driving is at an all-time high. And so in order to prevent drunk drivers, we're going to require that every American install an interlock device into their car. Even if they have a squeaky clean record, you're going to have to get an interlock device. And you're gonna have to pay for it every month and blow into it before you can drive your car, just because drunk driving is on the increase and people are dying. If the government did that, people would freak out. But that's exactly what they're trying to do with guns. And what they're trying to push is this narrative that because some lunatic who had never committed a crime legally purchased a gun and then went out and committed a crime with it, you can't punish people for crimes they haven't committed yet. That's why they're not denied access to firearms. So you might be wondering, why is it in America that we really try to resist gun control in the first place? Well, in order to understand that, we need to understand what the Second Amendment really states and what it really means. And I'm gonna cut in a video clip here. I can't find the original uploader to give him credit. I downloaded this video from his channel a long time ago because I knew it was going to be a matter of time before it got deleted, and it did. And I can't find his channel anymore. So if you know the name of his channel, please put it in the comments and then we can give him credit for it.
But now we need to get into certain contemporary issues with the Second Amendment. And first and foremost, we have to deal with the language and grammatical structure controversy. Because apparently people these days don't know how to read or comprehend language and historical context. So there are people who actually believe that the Second Amendment only allows the right of the people in a militia to keep and bear arms. And this is where we get into grammar Nazi territory and have to analyze each and every phrase of the Second Amendment. But to preface, you need to understand that words mean what they mean when they were written. Now thankfully, the late Justice Antonin Scalia did most of the research for this next part in his opinion of the court on DC versus Heller. First, let's get into the prefatory and operative clauses, both of which are present in the language of the Second Amendment. A prefatory clause announces a purpose, while the operative clause announces the resolution or action to be taken or not taken. And here's how the clauses are split up in the Second Amendment. Let's start with the operative clause and dissect it phrase by phrase. The right of the people. This phrase is used two other times in the Bill of Rights, once in the First Amendment and once in the Fourth Amendment. And there's also similar phrasing in the Ninth Amendment. But each time it is used unambiguously to describe individual rights, not collective rights, or rights that can only be exercised through participation in some corporate body, or a militia. There are three other provisions in the Constitution that strictly use the phrase the people, once in the preamble, once in Article 1, Section 2, and once in the 10th Amendment. And in each of those instances, the phrasing of the people is not used in the context of individual rights, but collective powers, powers that belong to the people. In each of these instances, the people refers to the exercising or reservation of powers, such as the reserving of power to people in the 10th Amendment or the exercising of powers in Article 1, Section 2. Not rights, powers. Nowhere else in the Constitution does a right attributed to the people refer to anything other than an individual right. What's more is that in all instances of the phrase the people, it is used in reference to a class of people who are members of a national community or connection with this country. Meaning that when we say the people, we are not referring to subsets of people, like people in a militia, but are referring to the whole people. This is in opposition to the prefatory clause when it mentions the militia, as a militia is a subset of people. So reading the Second Amendment as protecting only the right to keep and bear arms in an organized militia therefore fits poorly with the operative clause's description of the holder of that right as the people. Another thing to understand about prefatory and operative clauses is that a prefatory clause does not limit or expand the scope of an operative clause. In fact, as stated in a general treatise on statutes by Sir Fortunatus Dwars from 1848, it is nothing unusual in acts for the enacting part to go beyond the preamble. The remedy often extends beyond the particular act or mischief which first suggested the necessity of the law. And in regards to the English court case Copeman v. Gallant in 1716, the Lord Chancellor Hardwicke stated that I can by no means allow of the notion that the preamble shall restrain the operation of the enacting clause, and that because the preamble is too narrow or defective, therefore the enacting clause, which has general words, shall be restrained from its full latitude and from doing that good which the words would otherwise and of themselves import. So when you talk about something particular, like a militia, that doesn't then constrain the following phrase of the people into the context of a militia, meaning that the Second Amendment protects an individual right of all Americans. So now we move on to the phrase to keep and bear arms. Let's start with the word arms. The 18th century meaning of the word arms is the exact same meaning as it is today. In the 1773 edition of Samuel Johnson's dictionary, it defined the word arms as weapons of offense or armor of defense. And the 1771 legal dictionary by Timothy Cunningham defined the word arms as anything that a man wears for his defense, or takes into his hands, or useth in wrath to cast at or strike another. And even the 1828 Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language also uses the same phrasing. And even today's Webster's definition of the word arms is the exact same as it was back then. The word arms, then as now, does not apply only to military service or service in connection to a militia. In fact, here's an example sentence from Timothy Cunningham's 1771 legal dictionary. Servants and laborers shall use bows and arrows on Sundays, and not bear other arms. Even the 1783 thesaurus titled The Distinction Between Words Synonymous in the English Language, while it may have limited the term arms to instruments of offense generally made use of in war, it also states that arms constitute all firearms. At this point, some of you might be seeing now how this intersects with the "it only applies to muskets" argument. We'll get to that in a bit, but let's finish off this militia argument. So now let's dig into the meaning of the word keep. Going back to the 1783 thesaurus, it defines the word keep as we keep what we intend not to part with. We keep that which is our own. And the 1773 edition of a dictionary of the English language defines it as to retain, not to lose, and to have in custody. So now knowing what arms means, to keep arms can most naturally be read as to have weapons. Now there's no specific phrasing of to keep arms in a dictionary, but the way the phrase was commonly used and referred to was as a way of possessing arms, both individually and also in regards to a militia. Some people cite laws in Delaware, New Jersey, and Virginia that stated the phrase keep arms in the context of a militia, meaning that you can only use the phrase keep arms when talking about a militia. But Justice Scalia points out that that's like saying that because there are many statutes that authorize aggrieved employees to file complaints with federal agencies, that the phrase file complaints has an employee-related connotation, and that you can't file a complaint for any other reason if you're not an employee of an institution. Yeah, that doesn't quite work, guys. Moving on to the next phrase of bear, this has always, then and now, meant to carry. Here's that 1773 dictionary again. But when used in the context of arms, good old Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg seems to have given a very good descriptor of its meaning in Muscarello v. United States when analyzing the meaning of the phrase carries a firearm. In that case, she wrote, "Surely, a most familiar meaning is, as the Constitution's Second Amendment indicates, wear, bear, or carry, upon the person or in the clothing or in a pocket, for the purpose of being armed and ready for offensive or defensive action in a case of conflict with another person." Nowhere here is the act of bearing arms mentioned in relation to service in a militia or other organized military unit. Moreover, in 9 state constitutional provisions written in the 18th century or the first 2 decades of the 19th, they enshrined a right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state, or bear arms in defense of himself and the state. It is clear from those formulations that bear arms did not refer only to carrying a weapon in an organized military unit. When Justice James Wilson analyzed the Pennsylvania Constitution's arms-bearing right, he also recognized it as a natural right of self-preservation and defense of one's person or house. Once again, this is an individual right not limited to service in a militia. There is no dictionary that defines the phrase bear arms only in relation to military service, and there are numerous instances of its usage in non-military affairs, such as the already mentioned example sentence from Cunningham's 1771 legal dictionary. So any usage of the phrase bear arms in military contexts do not limit the term to that context. This is important because the former Justice John Paul Stevens and the dissent in the D.C. v. Heller case pointed to a study by various professors of linguistics and English that cited 110 instances of the phrase bear arms being used in the context of military service. So according to them, the phrase bear arms can only mean the carrying of arms for military purposes. This is how the dissent decided to reason. Well, if the founders wanted to say that all people have the right to carry arms, they should have made a qualifier after bear arms and written something like the right to bear arms for all citizens of America not in a militia, or something. But as Antonin Scalia points out, this makes absolutely no sense. If the idea is that bear arms can only mean to carry arms for military purposes, then you can't add a modifier to that statement outside of military purposes because it would blatantly contradict the phrase it is trying to modify. So a sentence like the right to bear arms for the purpose of killing game, which was a sentence that these professors decided to exclude, in this context would be like something out the mouth of a moron. So you can only carry a weapon for military purposes to hunt animals? Yeah, no. Bear arms means to carry arms, or possess arms, or have arms. And the fact that you can modify with purposive qualifiers objectively means that it is not limited to military use. But also, the phrase bear arms has a different idiomatic meaning when you place the word against after it, which directs hostilities towards a target for the purposes of war, fighting, military service, or serving as a soldier. And in nearly all of the examples that the professors of linguistics and English gave, they include the word against after bear arms. Now obviously, if these professors and linguists decided to give bear arms this idiomatic meaning, to bear arms would cause the protected right to consist of the right to be a soldier or to wage war, an absurdity that no commentator has ever endorsed. Which is why they, and Justice Stevens, created a hybrid meaning of the phrase bear arms to mean to carry arms in connection with service in the military, or in this case a militia. Again, no dictionary anywhere has ever taken on this meaning of bear arms. Antonin Scalia also writes that worse still, the phrase keep and bear arms would be incoherent. The word arms would have 2 different meanings at once. Weapons as the object of keep, and as the object of bear, one half of an idiom. It would be rather like saying he filled and kicked the bucket to mean he filled the bucket and died. For those viewers watching who are not well accustomed to the English language, another meaning of the phrase kick the bucket means to die. But even in the original English Bill of Rights, which was again the primary source of inspiration, there was no mention of an individual right to bear arms in relation to a militia. In fact, William Blackstone, in his commentaries on the laws of England from 1765, made no mention of military service or militia when he talked about the natural right of resistance and self-preservation, and the right of having and using arms for self-preservation and defense. Nowhere here does he talk about this natural right of self-preservation and defense in regards to the formation and service in a militia. Thus, the right secured in 1689 as a result of the Stuarts' abuses was by the time of the founding understood to be an individual right protecting against both public and private violence. And no word games on the meaning of bear arms and keep and right of the people is going to change that historical and textual context. So now let's shift back over to the prefatory clause and analyze each of these words and make sure they're in concordance with what was just described in the operative clause. A well-regulated militia. Alright, well let's go back to Webster's 1828 dictionary again. The militia of a country are the able-bodied men organized into companies, regiments, and brigades, with officers of all grades, and required by law to attend military exercises on certain days only, but at other times left to pursue their usual occupations. In Federalist 46, James Madison, a founding father, specifically wrote about a militia amounting to near 500,000 of citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. Thomas Jefferson, another founding father, in his letter to Deschutes de Tracy, wrote about the militia of the state, that is to say, of every man in it able to bear arms. Even in the 1939 Supreme Court case of the U.S. v. Miller, the court still retained this definition of a militia when explaining that the militia comprised all males physically capable of acting in concert for the common defense. So as clearly stated here, the militia is all of the people. This was another point that was contested by the dissent in D.C. v. Heller, because according to them, the militia is a federal creation, and they point to Article 1, Section 8 to justify this. But see, if you actually read Article 1, Section 8, you see that Congress is only allowed the power to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy. But when they talk about the militia, they say that Congress has the power to provide for calling forth the militia, which means that the militia is already something that exists, and that Congress has the ability to organize the militia, not a militia, which connotes that the militia is a body that already exists and is not something that the federal government can just create. And this is something that Congress has already done with the first Militia Act of 1792, which specified that each and every free able-bodied white male citizen of the respective states, resident therein, who is or shall be of the age of 18 years and under the age of 45 years, except as hereinafter accepted, shall severally and respectively be enrolled in the militia. Now, it's also important to note that this act, and the subsequent acts following it, do not define what the militia is, over just organizing together a subset of the militia, as allowed by Article 1, Section 8. But the federal government has no requirement to organize all of them together, and so they can focus on the subset that they see the most use in when calling forth the militia. Next is the phrase well-regulated, which means nothing other than the imposition of proper discipline and training. This same imposition was used in the Virginia Declaration of Rights from 1776 when stating that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. It does not mean federal government regulation like we know it today, or regulation from a governmental bureaucracy. If that was the case, the Second Amendment would have been framed as a militia well-regulated by the Congress being necessary to the security of a free state. Obviously, if this was the case, it would not provide enough of a separation of the militia from the federal government and the goal of preserving the security of a free state. It would be too close to the control of the federal government to preserve this free state should the federal government go tyrannical and start dismantling the militia or removing rights of gun ownership. It would make no sense for the Second Amendment, which was written as a protection from the federal government over natural rights, to also have that right act as a grant of power from the federal government. It's completely asinine and incongruent with anything. Well-regulated is not a grant of regulation to the federal government when literally the entire purpose of its existence is to declare an individual right that is out of the range of government interference. All able-bodied men are considered to be part of the overall unorganized militia, who are allowed individually or in concert to train and discipline themselves in the basics of military tactics in order to be ready to face any threats to the security of a free state. Which leads us to the last phrase of analysis, security of a free state. Now, this doesn't mean the security of each individual state, but to the security of a free polity, or the entirety of the organized society. Moreover, the other instances of state in the Constitution are typically accompanied by modifiers making clear that the reference is to the several states. Each state, several states, any state, that state, particular states, one state, no state, and the presence of the term foreign state in Article 1 and Article 3 shows that the word state did not have a single meaning in the Constitution. And so, as argued by the founders, militias are useful for repelling invasions, suppressing insurrections, rendering large standing armies unnecessary, and resisting government tyranny. So, now that we're all grammar Nazi'd out, and after all this historical, legal, and textual analysis has been laid out before you, does the prefatory clause fit in conjunction with an operative clause that creates an individual right to keep and bear arms? Yes. The history showed that the way tyrants had eliminated a militia consisting of all the able-bodied men was not by banning the militia, but simply by taking away the people's arms, enabling a select militia or standing army to suppress political opponents. This is what had occurred in England that prompted codification of the right to have arms in the English Bill of Rights. The founders were never arguing over whether or not such a natural right existed, but whether or not it had to be protected from the federal government and codified into the Constitution. The prefatory clause clearly indicates that because preventing the elimination of the militia is of utmost importance to the security of a free state, you cannot disarm the people, because the people make up the militia. And the most effective way to prevent the existence of a citizen's militia is to disarm the people. Thereby, the people have the right to keep and bear arms. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. So now that we've laid out the facts behind the Second Amendment, we need to get into all the other myths surrounding the issue. Though now that we've established this framework, it really makes tackling all the other myths a lot easier. So when you're arguing with someone who doesn't like evidence, or at least only cares about evidence when it supports their vision of the world, they like to do what's called moving the goalpost. So someone who's still watching and just lost all basis for their argument on it only applies to militias will now move the goalpost over to it only applies to muskets. Now, if someone is still trying to make that argument at this point in the video, they really weren't paying attention to the last 40 minutes, because it was essentially already dispelled with. But hey, let's get into it. No, the Second Amendment does not only apply to muskets. You'd think my bit earlier on the definition of arms would have already taken care of this, but no. First and foremost, the majority of the founding fathers who signed the Constitution and took office in Congress were all lawyers. If they wanted to limit the Second Amendment to muskets, they would have wrote a singular object of a musket rather than writing arms. Secondly, this is not how we interpret constitutional amendments. If we interpreted amendments as only pertaining to the material objects of the time, then literally every single word I have been uttering is not protected under law. Because you see, the First Amendment doesn't protect speech in YouTube videos, because in the founders' days, they didn't have YouTube, did they? They only had parchment, quill, and newspapers. See? I'm logicking! I'm doing logic! Yeah, no. These amendments apply to all forms of modern uses, and that includes all instruments that constitute bearable arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding. For anyone to think that messages they send on their iPhones are not protected under the First Amendment is absolutely ridiculous. And the same applies to the Second Amendment and muskets. And as I already stated before, arms back during the ratification of the Second Amendment meant weapons of offense or armor of defense. It does not mean freaking muskets. So now that that argument has been taken care of, the goalpost will probably shift over to, well, they only knew about muskets. What? Okay, so this argument seems to try and justify the former unfounded argument by trying to say that the only weapons in use at the time were muskets, so even if they didn't specifically say muskets, they only had muskets. So I suppose in order for you to take up this argument, you need to be really ignorant on the history of firearms. And you have to also think that the founding fathers were just straight up morons who had no capacity to think ahead or ponder about what the future might look like.
Hey George. Yeah? What if guns, get better?
The argument usually goes something along the lines of, look at this musket. It's from the days of the founding fathers. It only shot 1 round every minute. They never expected a gun would exist that could shoot more than 1 round every minute. Therefore, only muskets. Well, history doesn't really support this argument either. So let's just take a look back in time at all the weapons that existed and existed hundreds of years before the Second Amendment was ever written that shot more than 1 round at a time. Ever heard of hand cannons? These things were first created in the 13th century and introduced to Europe as early as the 14th century. Later renditions included hand cannons that can shoot up to 10 rounds. Ever heard of volley guns? This one's got up to 20 barrels. 16th century stuff, man. How about the duckfoot pistol? That looks like more than 1 round to me. What about the pepper box revolvers? These things were around for hundreds of years before the Second Amendment and could hold up to 20 rounds. Hey, here's a gun that was developed during the Revolutionary War, the Belton flintlock. And according to Joseph Belton, the guy who made it, it could fire up to 8 rounds with 1 loading. 8 balls, one after another, in 8, 5, or 3 seconds of time. He also had a way of modifying this gun to fire 16 to 20 rounds at a time. Oh, and the founding fathers specifically knew about this one. You know how we know that? Because the guy who made this gun tried to sell it to them at the Continental Congress. Yeah. Now, unfortunately for him, they didn't end up buying his gun. But you better believe they had knowledge of a gun that could fire multiple rounds within seconds with one trigger pull.
Oh shit, cross that out, right of the people to keep and bear arms,
Except for this belt and flintlock thing, because it fires multiple rounds and that's scary. Or hey, what about the Girondoni air rifle? This was already in service in the Austrian army by 1780 and used in the Napoleonic Wars, well over a decade before the Second Amendment was ratified, and could fire 20 rounds from a magazine in less than 30 seconds. Not only that, Thomas Jefferson used this gun to outfit the Lewis and Clark expedition with. In Meriwether Lewis's first diary entry, he mentions how he demonstrated the firepower of the air rifle to the people living on Bruno's Island. In fact, they nearly killed a woman when Mr. Blaise Cenas, being unacquainted with the management of the gun, suffered her to discharge herself accidentally. The ball passed through the hat of the woman about 40 yards distant, cutting her temple about the fourth of the diameter of the ball. She fell instantly and the blood gushing from her temple. We were all in the greatest consternation. Suppose she was dead, but in a minute she revived to our inexpressible satisfaction, and by examination we found the wound by no means mortal or even dangerous. They traveled across the entire United States with this gun and showed it off to various Indian tribes as they went along. Oh, and also, it's not a musket, it's a rifle. Or hey, what about the puckle gun? This was patented in 1718 and was one of the first machine guns or prototype Gatling guns ever created that could fire 63 rounds in 7 minutes. Or before that, there was the Kalthoff repeater, which could fire up to 6, 7, 12, or even 30 shots that could be reloaded in 1 to 2 seconds. So all of these guns had either existed before or during the time of the Revolutionary War and the ratification of the Second Amendment. There weren't just muskets in the world, people. Alright, I think that just about wraps it up for the Second Amendment arguments. There's still a bunch of other gun-related myths out there with things regarding semi-automatic weapons and firearms licensing and the such, but that's more of a gun control issue than it is pertaining directly to the Second Amendment. But with all the contemporary Second Amendment issues, there's one more goalpost that this debate shifts to, and that's you're racist. Okay, yeah, we're done here. If I have to say one thing on the semi-automatic rifle conflict though, just know that more people are killed from knives, clubs, hammers, and bare hands and feet in this country than are killed by assault rifles. Now, if you don't like guns, or don't like the Second Amendment in general, or are in favor of certain gun control policies, you can take that stance, and you can try to argue and reason for that stance. What you can't do is to start lying about the Second Amendment and what it has meant and been interpreted to mean for centuries. That's not going to help you. And in my opinion, the 1846 Supreme Court case of Nunn versus Georgia sums all of this up perfectly. The right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the whole people, old and young, men, women, and boys, and not militia only, to keep and bear arms of every description, not such merely as are used by the militia, shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon in the smallest degree. And all this for the important end to be attained, the rearing up and qualifying a well-regulated militia so vitally necessary to the security of a free state. Our opinion is that any law, state or federal, is repugnant to the Constitution and void, which contravenes this right originally belonging to our forefathers, trampled underfoot by Charles I and his 2 wicked sons and successors, re-established by the Revolution of 1688, conveyed to this land of liberty by the colonists, and finally incorporated conspicuously in our own Magna Carta. It was clear in the 18th century what the Second Amendment meant, it was clear in the 19th century. It was clear before ratification, it was clear after ratification. This is what the Second Amendment has always meant throughout its entire history, and always will mean.
So as he stated, the original intent of the Second Amendment was to keep the population armed so that we could defend against enemies, both foreign and domestic. Just go look at what Stalin or Lenin or Adolf Hitler or what happened in Rwanda, the Ottoman Empire. And that's just to name a handful. There's a lot more countries. What they would do is they would create a gun registry. And this is why we don't have a gun registry in the United States. And a registry simply tells the government who owns the guns and what kind of guns they own. In every single instance, almost in history, where they did this, confiscation came later. After came the genocide of millions and millions of people. The forefathers that wrote the Second Amendment knew this, and so therefore that's why we have the right to keep and bear arms. And as the gentleman previously stated, the militia are the people, and therefore any gun law on the books is actually an infringement upon our rights. That includes concealed carry permits, etc. Now, in the media today, in the wake of these mass atrocities, you're gonna hear a lot of buzzwords. One of them's called weapons of war, and the other one is assault weapons or assault rifles. Now, here in a little bit, we're gonna go through a lot of the different gun control laws that were instituted in the United States throughout the 1900s to today. You're gonna see some things that you didn't probably know. But before we get to that, let's look up what the definition of an assault rifle actually is according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. An assault rifle is a military firearm that is chambered for ammunition of reduced size or propellant charge, and it has the capacity to switch between semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. And that's very important because, as you're going to see here in a little bit, we're going to get to a gun control law that was written in 1986, and they've already banned select fire guns that can switch between semi-automatic and fully automatic. Nobody actually uses a real assault rifle in any of these mass atrocities. Contrary to popular belief, the military doesn't use an AR-15. The guns that they use look very similar to an AR-15. All of the weapons that they used are select fire, meaning they can either switch between full auto and semi-automatic, or they switch between semi-automatic and 3-round burst. And a 3-round burst is exactly what it sounds like. You pull the trigger once, and it will shoot out a burst of 3 bullets. None of these weapons are legal on the civilian market today. So when you hear politicians saying we need an assault weapons ban, the word assault is a verb. It's not a noun. If someone killed someone with a hammer, you could say we should ban assault hammers. And the problem with the wording of a lot of these new laws is they could call any firearm an assault weapon. Now, I don't want this video to sound like that I'm minimizing the severity of these mass shootings, because I do understand the severity of it. And I think that every one of these children needs to have legitimate protection from these types of atrocities happening. Let's take a little trip and let's look at how criminals actually obtain firearms. In a 2019 survey conducted by the Department of Justice, they found that 43% of criminals bought their firearms on the black market. They also found that 6% acquired them by stealing them, 10% made an actual retail purchase, and 0.8% purchased the weapon from a gun show. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, there's no such thing as a gun show loophole. There really isn't. All the firearms manufacturers and retailers that set up a booth at a gun show have to run a background check according to federal law. The loophole is what they call a loophole, and it's not. Is basically somebody goes to a gun show and they're looking at a gun at a booth. Somebody comes up, rubs their shoulder and says, "Hey man, I got that same gun for sale. It's in the trunk of my car." And then that person goes out to the parking lot, buys a gun out of a trunk of a car. And in 11% of the cases, the criminal had someone else buy the gun for them. This is known as a straw purchase. Let's say I can't legally buy a gun because I'm a felon. Well, maybe I have a girlfriend that's not a felon, and I say, "Hey, go in there and buy this gun for me." That is federally illegal already. If caught, both of them have to pay the price and go to prison. That is a federal crime to do a straw purchase. Now, if we look at the nature of a lot of these mass atrocities, regardless of where it's at, they typically happen where the perpetrator knows that people aren't armed and can't return fire. That way they can create as many casualties as possible before they either turn the gun on themselves or the police take them out. They want to make a big splash in society, and they want to be remembered for something. That seems to be the common thread amongst a lot of these mass shooters. If we pass a law that prevent an 18-year-old kid from buying a gun, well, yeah, you just stopped him from buying it legally, but he's either going to buy one out of the trunk of a car on the black market or maybe on the dark web. He's going to steal it, or he's going to participate in an illegal straw purchase. So we already have laws on the books to prevent criminals from getting the firearms. The problem is a lot of these laws aren't really enforced correctly. So let's pretend, for example, that we had an assault weapons ban today. What mass shooting would that have prevented? Because if you look back at history, we had an assault weapons ban in 1994 to 2004. And you're going to see in a little bit, one of the most horrific mass shootings in America happened during an assault weapons ban. Didn't stop it at all. Another term that you're going to hear is red flag laws. Now, these laws completely unconstitutional because basically the way they work is, let's say you have guns and your neighbor for some reason doesn't like you. Now, the way it's supposed to work in theory, say you have a loved one or a neighbor and you're like, dude, this person is nuts, and you know they have guns. You're supposed to be able to go to the police or to a court, file a petition, and then they will have a hearing without that person there, meaning ex parte. The police go to that person's house, seize their guns, and then theoretically the person, if they can prove they're not a threat to themselves or others, will get their guns back. But unfortunately, in practice, that never happened. And there's been a lot of frivolous cases so far where somebody just wanted to spite another person, falsely accused them of being a threat to themselves or others, and they didn't have their guns. So if they would have had a home invasion during that time, they wouldn't have had a way to defend themselves. And, you know, these red flag laws, they violate a bunch of different amendments. They violate the Sixth Amendment that provides that a person accused of a crime has a right to confront a witness against them in their criminal action. Because they're holding a hearing without you there, you never have a right to confront them. It's also a violation of the Fourth Amendment, where the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons of things to be seized. The other problem with red flag laws is they subvert due process. And due process simply means you're presumed to be innocent until you're proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be guilty. And so with a red flag law, they take someone's word that you're a threat to yourselves or others, and then they punish you by coming and taking your guns. And so you're presumed guilty before you can even prove your innocence. And that's a slippery slope, not just for guns, but for any court case in the United States. I mean, just imagine the consequences that would have on every other law in America. Now they can argue, well, in this type of instance, people are guilty until proven innocent. Therefore, people should be considered guilty until proven innocent for every other matter regarding the law and go into court. It's a very slippery slope. Now, something that a lot of people have spoken about, and it seems like the political left doesn't want to hear this, but the only way to really defend our children is to arm the schools. And I know y'all are like, oh, that sounds crazy, but private schools have been doing this for years. In fact, in a lot of private schools have armed guards, they have armed security, and or the staff is armed. And you want to know how many shootings have occurred at private schools? 6%. The other 94% were at public schools, which are just called soft targets because they declare themselves a gun-free zone. I think Colion Noir said it best. If Joe Biden's child would have went to that school in Uvalde, there would have never been a shooting. You know, we protect presidents with guns. We protect movie stars with guns. We protect banks with guns. We protect federal buildings with guns. We protect politicians with guns. Why are the children of America not also protected by guns when they're at a government facility, aka a public school? Because if we go back to the psychology of these mass shooters, they want to go to a place where they know a lot of people aren't armed so that they can get that body count super high by the time the police arrive. By the time good guys with guns arrive on the scene, the shooting is typically over. Now, I know the Uvalde incident is completely different because the cops just sat outside for 45 minutes. That is a whole different story, and that's a whole nother can of worms, and we're not going to get into that today. But on average, when the good guys with guns arrive, usually the perpetrator is killed or they kill themselves, shooting over. So imagine a perpetrator arriving at a school just to be met with armed security. So let's go back to this chart right here. Why was crime so high from 1900 all the way up until around 1930, 1933? From the data that I can find, and it's very limited on what I can find, there's a couple of different contributing factors to the rise in homicide rate in the early 1900s. One was, a lot of people were coming from other countries and immigrating into the United States. And then you get this clash of cultures between people. And a lot of the crime were in the cities because people were condensed together. They were from different cultures. They didn't understand one another. It creates a lot of conflict. And sometimes out of conflict results a homicide. The other contributing factor was urban gangs. Now, the gang problem wasn't that bad in the 18th century and in the 19th century. It wasn't until we got into the early 1900s where the streets in New York were dominated by 4 large gangs. Gangs were involved in the strong arm of robbery and gang warfare and political corruption. Then in 1920, prohibition was enacted, and that gave rise to the urban gangs that were often affiliated with political parties, and organized crime became a thing because now they could make money off of smuggling alcohol to people. Now, why do we see this sharp decline, right here in the 1930s? There are multiple theories about this. One theory is the very first piece of gun control legislation was introduced here. But I don't think that that's what the contributing factor was. We'll talk about that in a second, but first let's talk about the first piece of gun control legislation. 1934 is the very first piece of legislation that was passed, known as the National Firearms Act, aka the NFA. President Roosevelt signed this into law as part of his New Deal for crime, and it was meant to curtail gang crimes of that era, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In that day and age, gangs were sawing off shotguns, they were sawing off rifles to make them shorter, and they were getting suppressors and silencers. They were hiding them under their trench coats, and that's how they would rob banks and commit crimes. Think Bonnie and Clyde type stuff. The NFA imposed a tax on the manufacturing, selling, and transporting of firearms listed in the law. So in order to own a short-barreled rifle or a short-barreled shotgun or a machine gun or a silencer, you had to pay a $200 tax to the federal government. And then you get to keep those weapons. But they didn't actually make anything illegal. They just made them legal for a price. Now, in today's dollars, that $200 tax would amount to $4,315. Now, thankfully, in the bill, they didn't include a clause for inflation, so the tax stamp is still $200. Now, the reason I don't think that the piece of gun control legislation was the reason that crime decreased is because right here at the same exact time as this piece of gun control legislation coming through was the prohibition ending, meaning alcohol was now decriminalized, because before it was organized crime controlling the alcohol. Well, if you take that power away from them, you also take away a lot of crime. And then from this point all the way until the late 60s, homicide rate was at an all-time low, which goes back to the earlier in the video when I started talking about, hey, everybody had access to guns back then. There was no mass shootings. So now we got to ask ourselves, what changed in the late 60s that make everything just skyrocket? Now, the 1960s was one of those decades that was very pivotal in American history. It was one of those decades where there was a lot of things that needed to happen, but there was also a lot of things that didn't need to happen. As an example, we were definitely needing to squash racism. We needed civil rights. We needed equal rights for all men. We needed equal rights for women at the time. But there was a lot of bad that came out of the 60s as well. Going into 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Going into 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. Going into 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And then not only that, we had the race riots that were going on in the streets. And as a response to this, in 1968 came our second piece of gun control legislation that made a big impact on the American citizen. President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968. There was a lot of different types of laws that were in there regarding interstate commerce, but for the average citizen, this bill was the first time where there was an age restriction placed on the purchase of firearms, and it was the first time where prohibited persons couldn't buy a firearm. People who have been shown to be mentally ill, people who are felons, people who have been involved in domestic violence, and things of that nature. Now, although that piece of gun control legislation went into effect in 1968, why is it that homicide rates continued to skyrocket and held it all the way until the early 1990s? Well, I have a few theories about this. One of the things that came out of the 60s was the proliferation of drug use. Now, I don't care if you choose to do drugs, whatever the case is. This is just a fact. More people were doing drugs than ever in the 1960s until now than ever before in history, with the exception of alcohol. People did cocaine and opium way back when, but it wasn't as proliferated through society as it was from the 1960s moving forward. The next thing that happened in the 1960s was they took Christianity and the Bible out of school. Now, I'm not here to tell you that it needs to be in school. I'm just here to tell you that is one thing that happened in the 1960s. I believe it was 1962. It was removed from the school system. Another thing that happened in the 1960s was divorce was made more socially acceptable and easier and cheaper for people to obtain. And this is going to be actually a really big contributing factor, and we're going to explore it deeper here in a second. In addition to that, going into 1973, abortion was made legalized, which we'll cover that a little bit more in a little bit because of the recent Roe v. Wade decision. But all of those things came out of the 60s and the early 70s. In addition to that, the Vietnam War was the first war that was ever televised on television. You know, the Vietnam War went from 1955 all the way to 1975. Prior to that, only people that saw war were the people who were actively involved in war. This was the first time in world history where the common citizen who wasn't at war got to see what war was like. And I think that this had a huge impact on the American psyche. It's also worth mentioning what the economy was like. If you look at this graph right here, you see some blue arrows pointing up, some blue arrows pointing down. And in the gray shaded areas are considered economic recessions. You'll notice from the late 60s all the way up until about the late 80s, early 90s, we had 5 recessions. In addition to that, the 1970s was the first time that we saw a shock in the rise of oil prices of gas, similar to what we're seeing today. And it started in the late 60s and it continued all the way through the end of the 80s. As you can see here, as we get to the late 80s, from like 1988, we didn't have another crash until the 2002 dot-com bubble. And then we didn't have another crash until the 2008 financial crisis, which most of us are familiar with. So if you look at the density of recessions from, say, 1969 to 1989, there was a total of 5 recessions. And then if you look at the total recessions from 1990 until, let's just say today, for example, there was only 2. I think there's another one around the corner, but that is a story for a different video. But typically when we go into a recession, unemployment skyrockets. People still need to eat. People still need to pay the bills. And because of that, some people have to resort to crime in order to live. As a result of crime, sometimes homicides happen, which I think that this is also a strong supporting factor to why we saw an increase from the late 60s all the way until 1990. Then in 1986, Congress passed the Firearms Protection Act. Also a bunch of different laws that were placed into the Firearms Protection Act. However, there was one law that really affected the standard person. The bill prohibited civilian ownership or transfer of machine guns, also known as full auto, that were made after May 19th, 1986, and they redefined the word silencer to include parts intended to make silencers. So in essence, you could buy a full auto gun that was made prior to May 19th, 1986. However, said gun had to go through the 1934 NFA Act, which means you had to submit your fingerprints and pay your $200 tax stamp. Now, what's interesting about this is any full auto guns that are made after May 19th, 1986 can no longer be owned or possessed by a private citizen. Now, prior to this rule going into effect, you or me or anyone that's watching this video, we could go buy a machine gun, no problem at all. We just pay our $200 tax stamp, and now any machine gun that's available, we can have it and possess it. Prior to this law, machine guns would probably cost you about $800 or so for like an M16. However, after this, because of supply and demand, the price for an M16, $20,000, $25,000 today, if not more. The Brady Handgun Prevention Act was passed after the House Press Secretary James Brady was permanently disabled from an injury suffered during an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton signed this law into effect, and it required that background checks be completed before a gun is purchased from a licensed dealer, manufacturer, or an importer. It established the National Instant Criminal Background Check system that we have in place today, which is maintained by the FBI. We also call this system the NICS system. You had to fill out a form called the 4473, which we fill out today. And you fill that out, they run a background check. If you've had any mental problems that have been noted by the government, if you've been involved in any type of felony, if you've been involved in any type of domestic violence dispute, you can't buy a gun legally. Then 1 year later, in 1994, President Clinton passed the controversial Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Essentially, this was an assault weapons ban, meaning nobody from 1994 through 2004 could manufacture or purchase or transfer a semi-automatic, what they called an assault weapon. The only way you could own it was unless you lawfully possessed it before the date of enactment of this. And it also banned magazines that held more than 10 rounds. Now, if you look back at history, did it stop any school shootings? I can think of one right off the top of my head that happened right smack dab in the middle of the assault weapons ban. There was also another 3 pieces of legislation in 2003, 2005, and 2008, but we don't really have enough time to get into it today. The thing that we want to pay attention to today is, why was it that prior to 1966, why wasn't there any mass shootings at schools? But then in 1968, when they start passing all these laws saying you got to be a certain age to buy a gun, you got to get a background check to buy a gun, you can't own fully automatic weapons anymore. Why is it after all that, these types of mass shootings have skyrocketed? Now, I wanted to share something with you about the Uvalde incident that I don't think anyone else has talked about. So I'm going to show you a news clip from the year 2018.
Our top story, 19 years after the mass shooting at Columbine High School in Colorado. Police stop an attempted copycat attack west of San Antonio. 2 Uvalde teens are in custody tonight. Police say they plan to attack Morales Middle School.
Eyewitness News reporter Henry Ramos traveled to Uvalde, where he uncovered the disturbing details of this student's plot.
2 Uvalde middle schoolers, just ages 13 and 14 years old, at the center of this investigation tonight after police say they just recently searched how to make explosives that they were going to use during the attack, and then they were going to start killing students from a hit list they reportedly had. Police say the planned mass casualty attack was going to happen to students on the anniversary of the Columbine massacre. But one of the students encouraged the other to do it this year at Morales Junior High. Police say the 2 middle schoolers were doing their homework on how they wanted to carry out the attack. One of the students reportedly had numerous drawings and writings that showed weapons causing mass destruction. One even reportedly had an academic analysis from the Columbine shooter's journal. He wrote about being godlike and killing police and other persons.
Yeah, it was scary.
Shaylin Walton has a 7th grader who goes to the middle school. She says she was shocked when her daughter told her the news.
We hear it everywhere else, but you don't expect for it to happen in your town.
The Texas Rangers joined in the investigation and found that 2 students had looked up the tactics used in Columbine. Investigators say they were going to start the attack by detonating IEDs, then kill as many students possible before taking their own lives.
I'm thankful. I'm glad that they were able to control the situation before anything does happen.
Police say that the students used their school-issue iPads to talk about the attacks. The 2 were arrested on conspiracy to commit murder. They are currently in a juvenile justice center. Also, the school district did notify parents by sending out a letter. Reporting from Uvalde, Henry Ramos, KENS 5, Eyewitness News.
So as I mentioned, that news clip was from 2018. The 2 boys, they didn't talk about their names because they were minors at the time, and they were only 13 and 14 years old. There's 2 things that weren't even mentioned that were actually mentioned on the actual news website in a text format. They didn't put it in the video, but check this out. Now, this is all from 2018. Uvalde CISD issued a statement on Thursday. Our school district is committed to the safety and education of all of our students, and we want to clearly communicate about safety issues when they arise. One of our Morales Junior High students was experiencing a crisis. Upon rendering aid and support, the student revealed a plan to conduct a school shooting in the year of 2022. With the type of detailed information that was revealed by the student, law enforcement, and confirmed in their investigation, the student has been arrested and will not be returning to our school. Our school district has a strong partnership with a local law enforcement agencies, yada, yada, yada. I've actually been to Uvalde, Texas about 4 times. If you've ever seen any of my previous videos where I filmed drive tanks or where I filmed the giraffes and stuff, that's all in Uvalde, Texas, or just outside of Uvalde. It's a very, very small town. So here's a few things that stick out to me about this. There was 2 middle schoolers. One was age 13, one was age 14. In 2018, they were arrested because they were planning to use IEDs on the anniversary of Columbine. But then they were later again arrested because they had a detailed plan to conduct a shooting in the year 2022. Now this year, in 2022, exactly 4 years later, the student who committed the atrocity was 18 years old. How old would he have been in 2018? Now, I'm not saying that he is the same person. as these two. But what I am suggesting is he's probably friends with them and he just wasn't caught. Moreover on that, something else that has popped up on my radar. At first, I didn't know if it was fake news or not, but I started investigating it and actually found it on the Uvalde School District's website, is they are part of a program called Social Sentinel, which is essentially a complex artificial intelligence that they use to monitor all their students' social media posts. And supposedly it's so advanced that it can sense intent without specific keywords and without specific hashtags.
It's the newest tool in stopping violence before it even starts. 9 on Your Side's Tom McKee is asking questions about this new partnership that sorts through 1 billion social media posts each day.
When students in King's schools left class for the day Thursday, it's likely many of them went straight to their phones to tap out messages on social media. However, if anything posted publicly seemed to be a threat, Social Sentinel was ready to catch it and alert the district. The contract with Social Sentinel is a direct result of the Parkland, Florida school shooting. Warren County superintendents met to try to find an extra layer of safety somewhere. Tom Isaacs heads the Educational Service Center.
It is geocaching a geographic area for a school district.
And strangely enough, obviously it didn't work because the Uvalde kid decided to make a post on Facebook multiple times. I mean, he even posted days or weeks before this ever occurred about him getting these guns, yada, yada, what have you. Now, there's other things that don't make sense about this case. Obviously, where did he get the money to buy such expensive gear? Why did the police officer sit outside for 45 minutes and not do anything? Why do these types of events tend to happen in clusters? For example, we've been seeing the reports of a ton of them the past couple of weeks. Why is that? Why do these types of events tend to happen in clusters? We've been seeing the reports of a ton of them the past couple of weeks. Why is that?
I don't know if you've ever come across the novel The Sorrows of Young Werther, written by Goethe back in 1774. The book is about a guy who falls in love with a woman who wasn't really interested in him, and in the end, he decides to end his own life. He planned a specific way of ending his life where he dressed himself in boots, a blue coat and a yellow vest, and sat at his desk with an open book and shot himself. After releasing the novel, a number of suicides were reported across Europe, with pretty strong evidence that at least some of the suicides were influenced by Goethe's novel. It was found that those who took their own lives were dressed similarly to Werther. They adopted his method, and in some cases, the book was even found at the scene of death. As a result, the book was banned all over Europe. This is now called the Werther effect, which refers to the phenomenon where a sharp increase in the rate of suicide occurs following the release of a high-profile suicide story. People who are exposed to the stories copy the behaviour that's presented in the media. Some suicides will even be done in exactly the same way as a suicide publicised in the media. Those exposed to the stories who can also relate to the people in the stories, this could be their age and or life circumstances, are more likely to copy the person in the stories and die from suicide. This increase seems mainly to occur in areas where the high-profile suicide stories are publicised. In 1974, Felix examined the number of suicide cases during the month in which the suicide stories were presented as front-page articles in the US media between 1947 and 1968. He also looked at the number of suicides in the month before the suicide stories appeared in the US media, as well as in the months following. Now, these suicides were not associated with the book The Sorrows of Young Werther, but referred to the number of people who took their own lives before and after suicide stories were publicised in the media during 1947 and 1968. The y-axis refers to the difference between the number of people who took their own lives that you would expect and not expect. A value of 0 means that as many people took their own lives as you would expect on average. So you would expect most of those values to be bouncing around 0 if the publicised suicide story had no effect on the number of suicides. Positive values mean that there are more suicides than we'd expect. Negative values mean there are fewer suicides than expected, probably due to some random variation. The x-axis shows the number of suicides the months before, the months during, and the months after the suicide stories appeared in the media. Phillips found that in the month before the stories appeared, the number of suicides were not higher than expected. However, during the month when the story appeared, as well as in the month following, the number of suicides were much higher than expected. It's not really until 2 or 3 months later that the number of suicides actually levels back out to average. And these are some serious statistics. You might look at this and go, okay, what's going on here? Well, maybe one thing that's happening here is that there's a whole bunch of people who are potentially suicidal and they're contemplating suicide, and what the suicide story does is it accelerates that process. It's like a catalyst for something that would probably happen anyway. But that's not really what the data is saying, because if that was true, we'd expect a big spike in the number of suicides in the month or 2 after the story was presented, because what we'd expect to see is a whole bunch of people who are considering suicide rush out and take their lives in the aftermath of the story. And then the number of suicides should go down into the negative territory for a while. However, that's not what this data shows, and that's why this data appears so scary, because the massive increase in the number of suicides all occurred around the time when the story was presented. And then the number goes down thereafter, suggesting that these are excess deaths. These are surplus deaths that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the publicised suicide story in the media. Phillips also looked at a number of suicides following the deaths of 8 presidents of the United States between 1900 and 1968, including after the assassination of JF Kennedy, and found no statistically significant increase in the number of suicides following these high-profile deaths. Nevertheless, a number of agencies around the world have developed national journalism codes to promote responsible reporting of suicides. These codes highlight the importance of using extreme restraint when publishing stories about deaths, such as avoid starting a television newscast with a story about suicide, avoid including the word suicide in the headlines, avoid placing a suicide story on the cover of a newspaper or a magazine, avoid sensationalising or romanticising suicide, avoid mentioning the details of the methods used, and keep the number of suicide stories at a minimum, and so on. So in many cases, if there's a suicide, media professionals use coded language to report the story. And sometimes we really have to read between the lines to find out how people took their own lives. Even though there are guidelines for media professionals to follow when reporting stories about suicide, it's up to the individual media professional to decide whether or not to follow them. A few years later, in 1979, Phillips claimed that the number of single driver vehicle fatalities increased by 31% 3 days following publicised suicides. He claimed that as the number of suicides publicised increased, so did the number of vehicle fatalities. Does this seem ridiculous to you? What could be going on here? There could be a couple of reasons. One reason could be that after seeing the suicide story in the media, people may become more reckless. Maybe a big story distracts people or kind of gets people in a different state of mind. Another reason is maybe these aren't accidents. Maybe some of these people are using their cars to kill themselves. Maybe hiding behind some of these car accidents are suicides. People are purposely driving off the road in their cars, slamming into trees and so on to take their own lives. It doesn't stop here. Phillips also found that the number of non-commercial plane crashes and airline crashes also increased after publicised suicides. He claimed that the spike in the number of plane fatalities persisted for around 9 days. He even claimed that the more suicide stories were reported in the mass media, the more the number of airline crashes and non-commercial plane crashes increased.
You know, the Werther effect is something I studied when I was in college, when I was taking an abnormal psych course. I did an entire paper on this and studied it very thoroughly. The data seems to state that just talking about it on the news is going to give these kids social validation to commit these atrocities. How do we actually prevent it? We stop talking about it. All these news stations, they don't care about these kids. The only thing these news stations care about is creating fear. Because if they can create fear, they can create a profit. Because every time you watch a video, even my videos, if that video happens to be monetized, I'm gonna make money. Every time you click an ad, someone makes money. So these news stations don't give a crap about these kids. All they care about is what's the next thing that bleeds, because that thing is gonna lead and make us money. Now let's talk about what I think is actually going on and how they can actually prevent people from buying guns without passing any more gun control legislation. So if we look back at history, going back to 1934, like we talked about with the National Firearms Act, they didn't really ban anything. They just increased the price to own it. You know, as I mentioned earlier, in 1934, a $200 tax stamp is equivalent to $4,315.06 in today's dollar. Nobody in the 1930s, except for the uber wealthy, could afford that. Moving on over to the 1986 full auto ban. They banned anything that was made after 1986, but if you had the money to buy a full auto that was made before 1986, then you could own it. And just for those of you that don't know, like to buy an M16 or something that was made prior to 1986, it's gonna be upward $25,000 to $35,000, if not more in today's dollars, just because there's such low supply of a pre-ban M16. Yeah, you pay your $200 tax stamp, but you're gonna pay over 25 grand for that one gun. They kind of outlawed it, but they made it legal for a price. And I think it's gonna be the same thing moving forward, except it's gonna be a lot more sinister. Now, I wanna be very clear. I'm not saying that this is what's gonna happen. I'm just saying, I think that the things that we're seeing in the news today are a complete distraction. You know, for probably the past 15 years, I've kind of looked at the news as to whenever they're really pushing something, I always ask myself one question. What are they trying to distract me from? And then I go digging. So aside from seeing, all these mass atrocities, being inundated in the past couple of weeks on the news, we're seeing a bunch of other things, right? We're being distracted by Amber Heard trial and Johnny Depp. We're being distracted with gas prices. We're being distracted with food prices. It's all fear. We've been distracted by a virus for the past 2 years. But what's really happening behind the scenes is something called the CBDC, or what's called the Central Bank Digital Currency. Now, in order for this to make sense, most people don't realize that the Federal Reserve is not a federally owned bank, it's actually a privately owned bank. Now, prior to 1913, the Federal Reserve was actually owned by the United States government, but a bunch of the big bankers such as JP Morgan and things of that nature, they created a market crash. Basically what they did was they created a bunch of bank scares. They printed out a bunch of articles in newspapers that said that the banks will lose your money. So go get your money out of the bank. Now, if you don't understand how banking works, banks don't ever have all of everyone's cash on hand. They loan it out, they invest some of it to gain interest, and what happened was all these people rushed out to create mass withdrawals, and it caused the banks to fail. And out of that fear, they pushed the Federal Reserve Act, which in turn turned over our Federal Reserve over to private bankers. And what's funny about that is they promised that this would curb inflation and all this stuff, but it's actually had the opposite effect. Now, interesting thing about this was the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23rd of 1913, and they actually voted on it when most of the members of Congress were out of town visiting their family, and so no one was actually present to vote against it. And then, years later in 1971, I think it was President Nixon who abolished the gold standard. And now we print money and then we increase inflation. And inflation basically robs people of whatever their wealth is. So if a pack of gum cost you 50 cents yesterday and we create inflation, it's now going to cost you $1. So whatever money you have in your account is essentially worth half of what it was. It's a way of robbing the American people. And as you can see, by adjusting inflation, you can adjust what people can afford and can't afford. But this isn't enough control for them. They need one other method of control if they want to prevent people from buying things, especially things like guns. So let me introduce you to something called PCA, also known as Personal Carbon Allowance. Now, because of this climate change stuff that everybody's been talking about, right now, large corporations that create a large carbon footprint have to buy what's called a carbon credit. And a carbon credit is created from projects in the world that are supposed to recapture or prevent carbon from being created. And every carbon credit is certified to offset 1 metric ton of carbon output. Big corporations that manufacture things like, say, Tesla, right? Like the manufacturing of electric cars is quite carbon intensive. They would have to buy a ton of these carbon credits in order to offset how much carbon they create. They want this net zero type deal. So what does that mean? So one, that means if companies are gonna have to buy these carbon credits to offset things, prices are just gonna go up. So you remember seeing this video probably from 2020 from the Davos group saying, the Great Reset, you'll own nothing and be happy. Well, this is how they're gonna do it. A lot of these think tanks especially those at the Davos group in the World Economic Forum, want to apply a PCA, or a personal carbon allowance. And essentially what that would mean is every single month, every person in a nation would be assigned a specific carbon allowance. So for example, the average human being produces, I think, 7.5 metric tons of carbon in a year. So they would divide that up amongst 12 months. Now, what happens if you go beyond that carbon allowance for the month? Well, then you're gonna have to pay a carbon tax, and you're gonna have to go buy a carbon credit. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. All these environmentalists and stuff, they don't like us eating meat, they don't like us buying gas, and guess what else they probably don't want us buying? Guns. Now, my assumption is they're gonna start assigning, like, this product creates this much carbon, therefore you're gonna have to offset that as well. Let's just say, for example, you got $1,000 in your bank account and you wanna go buy gas, but you've used up your allotment for personal carbon allowance for the month for gas. Well, then the government's gonna say, no, you can't buy that. And I'll tell you how they're gonna track it here in a second. Or let's say you wanna go buy meat for a cookout with your friends and family, and they're like, you know what? You've bought too much meat this month. You went over your personal carbon allowance. You're either gonna have to pay us this fee to buy a carbon credit to offset that, or we're gonna deny your charge. Or what if you wanted to buy some ammunition? What if you wanted to buy a firearm? What if you used too much electricity this month? Are they gonna cut your power off? I don't think they will actually cut people's power off, especially in hot states or in extreme climate states, because you would kill people. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them, but I don't think they would. They'll just tax you. But for other things, they would just deny the charge until you buy the carbon credit to offset it. Now, how are they gonna track this? Let me introduce you to something called the Central Bank Digital Currency, also known as a CBDC. Now, a CBDC is a cashless form of currency. It's a digital currency created by the Federal Reserve. They're already in the talks about creating this. It would essentially eliminate all cash. Instead of you putting your money in the bank at, say, Wells Fargo or what have you, now all of a sudden you're banking directly with the Federal Reserve. And it's going to run on a blockchain, but it won't be decentralized like Bitcoin. It will be on a centralized governmental blockchain. And then every transaction that you make, they will be able to tell what the carbon footprint of said product is, and they will be able to tell you yay or nay if you can buy it. So let's say, for example, you had a cookout this month, you had to go on a road trip, you had to go buy a plane ticket for something, and you're getting to the end of the month and you're like, man, I need some more ammo. And they're like, sorry, you've already used up too much of your personal carbon allowance. You're gonna have to go add funds and buy carbon credits in order to buy this, or they could just tell you straight up no. Now, the way that this can be controlled is right now you can buy carbon credits as an EFT. They're just gonna go up in value. And the reason they're gonna skyrocket in value is big corporations are gonna have to buy them to offset their carbon footprint. And because there's going to be such high demand from big corporations, an individual trying to purchase one will be astronomically priced, I'm assuming. Right when all the mass shooting stuff started taking off, I was trying to find out, what are they distracting me from? And they do report these things in the news, but they don't really push it. It might be one little written news article. It might be a 1-minute video that has no talking in it and just puts text on a screen. This is what's coming. Like, if you think shortages are bad, if you think inflation is bad, this is going to be the next big thing to come. Because, if you look at the 2030 agenda, they want net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And the only way to achieve that is to create these carbon credits. Now, how is a carbon credit actually created? So as an example, this is just one tiny example. Let's say I went out and bought 100 acres of a forest. And I said, I'm going to use this land and I'm going to preserve it. I'm going to have to create what's called an additionality factor to it and say, I'm going to invest so much money per year in preventing some kind of termite from destroying all of these trees. And because I'm doing that, I can now get my land certified to create carbon credits. And then I can sell those carbon credits to companies or other people. This is why I think that Bill Gates went and bought all the farmland. Yeah, a lot of people are saying it's to control food, and maybe that is true, but this is the other reason. All these people were buying up land so that they could create these projects to create carbon credits. So I know that I've thrown a ton of information your way in this video, what sense can we make about all of it? I know we kind of went off on some tangents here towards the end of the video, but I do think that there are some things that we can 100% learn from this. Number one, no amount of gun control seems to have any influence over the homicide rate in the United States. The homicide rate seems to be more influenced by economic factors such as inflation and recessions. When you just align the graphs, it seems to be one of the biggest influences. I'm not saying that's the only one, just saying there's a big one there. Another takeaway is, as of right now, we have the same homicide rate that we had in the 1950s, despite these particular types of mass atrocities increasing in nature. And we have seen from data and studies that the Werther effect seems to be the reason why these mass atrocities are on the rise. The other thing that we can take away from this, and it's something that we all need to be vigilant about, don't let the little wars that we're fighting, to maintain freedom, these little wars about gun control, not that they're not important, I'm just saying, let's not let the little wars distract us from what the powers that be are actually trying to accomplish behind the scenes, because they don't have to create gun control. All they got to say is that manufacturing of firearms and ammunition and other things like that creates a ton of carbon, and therefore these companies are going to have to buy a ton of carbon credits in order to manufacture, which means a lot of gun companies would go out of business. And not only that, but a lot of them will have to increase prices. And not only that, a lot of people won't be able to afford them because they'll have to worry about meeting their daily carbon allowance so that they can live and feed their family. Ultimately, this comes down to a system of ultimate control, not only just over your guns, but what kind of food you can eat. There was a video, I can't remember where it was, where Bill Gates was saying that eating meat is the most carbon expensive thing that we are producing in the world right now. They definitely want to take out meat. They definitely want to take out gas cars. Something that I don't know how many people in the gun community know about, but I know that a lot of us that are in the car community, we know about this. Kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, when I said, these types of gun laws, what they're trying to push into place are like telling every American person that they're going to have an interlock device in their car. Well, believe it or not, that bill was just signed early this year in Biden's infrastructure bill. It would give law enforcement access to a kill switch that will be attached to all new cars in 2026 and beyond. And they're saying that they're doing this because of drunk driving. And anyone with common sense can see where this is headed. Now, if you go over your personal carbon allowance for the month, now your car might not start. There's a lot of things that I could get into, and this is why the video is over a week late, is because I kept getting off into different trails that this whole thing can lead to, because there's so much to this, and there's so much more that I haven't even covered. But I just wanted to put this video out there for you guys, and hopefully this will benefit some people.